So now that we have the small screen version of our site working fairly well, we're going to start to work on styles for some of the wider width screens. In this particular example, I'm going to add more media queries than I probably normally would, but just as an example of how you can use media queries, I decided that I would add more than I might normally do in a regular project. So at the very small screen, this is what the page is going to look like. We're just going to make some very subtle changes when the screen just gets a little bit wider. I'm going to come down to the very bottom and we'll make a media query. So I'm going to go ahead and use @media_screen and min width. And the breakpoint that we're going to be using is going to be 455 pixels. And I just decided to use that because that's where I felt that my design started to have some issues and could use some media queries for a slightly wider screen. You might want to put a comment in here just to remind yourself of what's happening. And what we'll do here, just so we can utilize media queries, is we're going to do something that doesn't really affect usability but will just be more for fun. We're going to swap out that background image and have it display a different background image when it hits the breakpoint of 455. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same rule that we currently have in our body tag, but I'm just going to have an alternate image display. So I'm going to use small screen top2.jpg, which is an image that's slightly larger than the current one that we're using. The file size is a little bit bigger as well. So I want to make sure that I put the smallest image on there for the phone versions, and then if they're on a bigger screen, they might be on a better connection. We're going to have our promo images, which are these images right here, float to the left, and we're going to size them down, and then the text is going to kind of flow around them. So in order to do that, I'm going to be targeting .promo image, and we'll add a float of left, margin on the right. I'm going to set the maximum width to 50%, and the margin on the bottom is going to go to 14 pixels. If we save, you can now see that my images are going to appear smaller, and then the text is going to appear on the right hand side. So I just think that that improves the layout a little bit right here. We're going to get rid of these borders on the top of the H3s as well. So we'll just add a rule for H3 and we'll remove the border top. And the final thing that we're going to do is we're going to have our navigational items appear side by side. They're starting to get a little bit wide here, so we'll make a rule for the nav li. We're going to define the width to be 43%. I'm going to tell these to display as inline block, and I'll set a margin of 7 pixels all the way around. When we save now, you can see that the images now appear in this way. The other thing that I want them to do is appear side by side, so I'm going to need to float them on the left as well. Now once I've done that, I like what it's doing to the menus, but you can see I start to create some problems with layout. Because I'm floating these items, they have now been pulled out from the normal flow of the document. I need to put a clear in my HTML, so let's add that now. The first thing I'll do is I'll make a style in my CSS that's just going to clear, and I like to keep my class styles up near the top just because I find it easier to stay organized, so I'm going to put that right after my universal selector. And we'll make a rule for .clear it, and we're going to tell it to clear both. Then I'm going to go into my HTML, and after our navigation tag ends, because we put the float on the li, I'll actually add this to the unordered list. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear the float. So I'll add my div with the class of clear it, and now if we go back into the browser and refresh, you can see that now the site is looking more along the lines of what we want. So when my site is fully small, these will span the width of the screen, but when it just gets slightly bigger, they'll go to a more side-by-side layout. The other thing that I want to do is I want to address this image right here. This image is starting to be problematic because the text is starting to wrap around it. So what we'll do on that image is I'm going to add a class to that image. So here's the first image right here. I'm going to add a class to it, and I'm just going to call it pick align right, and then I'll define a rule in my CSS for pick align right, And we're just going to tell it to float on the right and add a margin on the left. I'll save, and if we refresh in the browser, you can now see that the image starts to go on the right hand side. So that's going to serve the page quite nicely as the page starts to scale up. There is a little bit of weirdness that occurs right here because you can see the text is wrapping. So in addition to that, I might scale the image down just a little bit. And because I want to scale the image down only for our media query, I'm going to use a specific rule and put it inside this portion of my media query. And I'm going to specify that my max width be slightly smaller at this point. So let's try 75%. That looks a little bit better. So now that I made the rule for pick a line right, I really like what's happening with this image once the screen starts turning into more of a mid-screen layout, but I'm not very keen on what's happening when the screen is still small. So I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to prevent this image from displaying at the smaller size screens. In order to do that, I'm going to go into my HTML. In addition to having the pick a line right, I'm going to add another class, and I'm going to call it no show. And then I'm going to make a style, and I'll put this up by my classes, and we're just going to make a style for no show and tell it to have a display of none. Now by default that image is not going to display on the page at all, and since it's not really, it's a picture of the orchids growing, but it's not content that is completely necessary, you can see it's not going to show up on either of these sizes. We'll call this back in once we start to make our mid-screen sizes. Just to point out as well, we have some issues that start to happen with our text down here also. I like the way this looks at the small screen, and then at our mid-screen it looks pretty good until it gets to a point where the headers start to kind of jump up to this line. I don't really like that. Since that behavior isn't really a factor at the very small screen, it just starts to have to be a factor on our larger screen. Let's add this to one of the selectors that we're currently using. If we look in our code, you can see that there's the article with a class of promo. That contains the H3 and the text as well as the images. So I'm just going to go into my media query, and I'm going to add a rule for .promo. I'm going to tell it to clear both, and I'll add a little bit of padding to the bottom. I'm going to use 7 pixels for the padding on the bottom. Now when we save and refresh, as the screen gets bigger, you can see that this header text no longer gets pulled up next to the description. So that is looking much better to me. Okay, so now our smallish screen looks good. Here's what it looks like on the very small screen, and then as we start to size up, you can see that this header image does switch out, and then as well as the layout changes. So this looks good until these images start to get a little too big and the text starts to look a little wimpy. So we'll have to create another media query to deal with that point. If you open your developer tools, and I'm working in Chrome, we've talked about the developer tools before, but as I resize my page, I'll get this little tooltip that appears up in the upper right hand corner, and then I can kind of tell what the width value is. So this is helpful because then I can start to ascertain where I might want to put my media queries, especially if I'm basing them off of a visual layout. I think this layout actually looks pretty good till about 750, 775 pixels. So we'll make a breakpoint somewhere around there and we'll switch the layout again. We'll be doing that in the next lecture.